This is T3 Raider Facts, and you are tuned in to the T3 Raider Roots podcast. We've been taking a look at the growth and development of the city of Oakland and the growth of the silver and black. Now, as a part of the NFL, the Raiders are going to take good to great in a year of huge steps, which came on the backs of several key moves made by Mr. Al Davis. So let's take a look at the year 1967. As 1967 began, Wayne Valley was still listed on the books as the owner of the Oakland Raiders, but he was not recognized as the leader of the organization. That distinction belonged to Al Davis, who in the less than 5 years that he'd been affiliated with the team, had already assumed the roles of head coach, commissioner of the AFL, and was its figurehead at the time of the merger with the NFL, was the Raiders' primary scout, and had now returned as a part owner and general manager. The city of Oakland was growing and thriving, and the town's professional sports team had opened a new stadium and finished back-to-back winning seasons. And now Al Davis would unveil the next act of his professional play, which was a masterpiece and fell just short of a stunning world championship. Many times Valley had referred to Al Davis as the genius, sometimes out of reverence and sometimes out of sarcasm. But now, Davis would truly demonstrate his ability as a talent evaluator with several bold strokes. One of these involved trading out the starting quarterback, Tom Flores, who'd been with the franchise from the beginning, to Buffalo, bringing in backup quarterback Darryl LaMonica. LaMonica was the backup to Jack Kemp his first 4 seasons. During his time in Buffalo, he became known as the fireman because he would come in on occasion and take over for Kemp, leading the Bills to several come-from-behind victories. He came into a team that was ripe and ready to win with talented players. Most teams were playing man-to-man defense. There weren't many 2-deep or 3-deep zones in those days. Darryl had a potent offense with Fred Biletnikoff, Warren Wells, Bill Miller, and Billy Cannon. The key to Davis's plan on offense was to stretch the defenses. Darryl just picked apart defenses, primarily with the deep ball. That's how he became known as the Mad Bomber, a nickname that was actually derived by Howard Cosell. He had a magnificent arm and could throw the ball deep and with a great deal of accuracy. Starting in 1967, Darryl will end up guiding the Raiders to 3 consecutive AFL Championship games and 1 Super Bowl. During that time, he was also an All-Pro and an MVP. He was the prototypical quarterback for an Al Davis offense, with the ability to strike deep, strike fast, and strike fear into opposing defenses. The vertical passing game remained the tactical weapon of choice for Davis for the rest of his professional football life. And Davis seemed to always be searching for the next Mad Bomber to take the reins. So as LaMonica was settling into his new role with the Raiders in 1967, success started to come early and often, and the city of Oakland was abuzz with excitement. Another move that Al Davis made was bringing in a tough old warhorse to be the kicker and the backup for LaMonica, George Blanda. George came to the AFL when it first started in 1960 and quarterbacked the Houston Oilers, leading them to titles in the first 2 years. At the time, George had already been in pro football for almost a decade, but he was seemingly only just beginning. When he came to the Raiders in 1967, he brought a confidence and a toughness that was unmatched. Whenever the Raiders needed him, he was there. He stayed on until 1975, 1 year before the Raiders won their first world championship, and then he was elected into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But Davis was not concerned with just the offensive weapons. On defense, he made a trade to the Denver Broncos that brought in cornerback Willie Brown. After finishing his collegiate career at Grambling and then starting out with the Broncos, Willie instantly became one of the dominating corners in the American Football League with the Raiders. He was good size for a corner in those days and very physical. In tight press coverage, Willie would line up, usually against the opposition's best receiver, and deliver a hard chuck at the line to stun the receiver and knock him off his route. Willie Brown was fleet of foot and could glide through coverages in addition to being physical, which is why Al Davis coveted him. Willie was never drafted, so he, like so many other players, was given a chance when the new AFL launched. Al knew what he was doing because Willie went on to a career that resulted in induction in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. with LaMonica, Blanda, and Brown all added into a squad that already included Fred Biletnikoff, perennial All-Pro Jim Otto, Clement Daniels, Hewitt Dixon, and Billy Cannon, as well as Clint McEwen and hard-nosed Dan Connors. The Raiders prepared for the 1967 draft, the first draft that was unified between the NFL and AFL, as the next step in their merger. Kansas City had won the AFL's Western Division in 1966 and had made it to Super Bowl I against the champion Green Bay Packers, largely on the formidable presence of Buck Buchanan, a huge defensive tackle who absolutely dominated the middle of the line for the Chiefs. Al Davis was looking for an antidote to Buchanan, a future Hall of Famer, and he'd uncovered a little-known offensive lineman named Eugene Upshaw at obscure Texas A&I, now called Texas A&M at Kingsville. Ron Wolf, Davis's talent scout, was preparing for the draft, and the young man he wanted to bring in was Arkansas halfback Harry Jones. Ron brought Jones and his family out to the West Coast and cajoled Davis into accompanying them to Ernie's restaurant in San Francisco, which Wolf knew was one of Al's favorite places to eat. Davis had already told Wolf that he was going to draft Upshaw, but Ron was convinced that upon meeting Harry Jones, Davis might change his mind. On draft day, the Raiders were set to pick at number 17. 2 spots behind them were the Philadelphia Eagles, who also had their eye on Upshaw. When the pick was announced, Wolf became incensed and questioned why Davis was interested in this unknown. But Davis knew exactly what his team needed, and he would not be swayed. But Joe Kuharich, head coach of the Eagles, did not give up. He contacted Upshaw down in Kingsville, Texas, and told Upshaw, "You don't want to go with the Raiders. They're bad people." He even persuaded Upshaw to call Al Davis and say, "I don't want to play in Oakland. I want to play in Philadelphia." The Eagles were offering to make a trade so they could acquire Upshaw's services. To make the deal more enticing, they even drafted Harry Jones, who they knew was high up on the Raiders' scouting charts, to use as trade bait. Pete Rozelle, the NFL commissioner and a good friend of Kuharich, called Davis and urged him to make the trade because he wanted to help his friend. Davis said simply, "He's ours. We're not giving him up." Upshaw came out to Oakland at the team's invitation and was sitting in a motel on Hegenberger Road, refusing to come to the offices. He was not happy. He was, in essence, waging a sit-down strike on the Raiders until they released him and let him go to the Eagles. Davis just said, "You're ours." Upshaw finally reported for an off-season practice. He had no real choice because with the league's merger, he had no bargaining position. On the first day of workouts, he didn't look very good in simple drills. Walking away, Wolf questioned Davis again and wanted to know what Davis saw in Upshaw. Davis never faltered. "He's going to be good," Davis insisted. "The one thing you can see in him is that he can run like an effing deer." He was big at 6'5" and 265 and wasn't going to be pushed around. Davis just knew instinctively from his appraisal of players that Upshaw was going to be outstanding. The Eagles kept calling about him, and Davis kept telling them that they were wasting their time. Eventually, they backed off. Upshaw was selected to play with the College All-Stars in the annual August game in Chicago against the NFL champion Green Bay Packers, and he was captain on that squad. He played at both center and tackle, his positions at Texas A&I. When he reported back to Raiders camp, he was installed at guard, and he was the immediate rookie starter on a team that went all the way to the Super Bowl. The funny thing is, Upshaw did not anticipate that the Raiders would be title contenders during his first year, so he'd already made arrangements to marry his sweetheart back home in Texas on December 30th, which turned out to be the day before the AFL Championship game against Houston in the Oakland Coliseum. Davis had to send Ron Wolf with Upshaw to San Antonio, Texas for the marriage ceremony, then had to hustle Eugene on a plane back to Oakland for the big game. "We were worried stiff about him not returning in time for the game," Davis said, "because our airport in Oakland got fogged in, but we managed to get him landed well before the kickoff." The Raiders beat the Oilers 40-7. The team then headed to Miami to face the Green Bay Packers in Super Bowl II. Then Upshaw was able to enjoy his honeymoon after that. Also in 1967, the Raiders picked up receiver Warren Wells purely by accident. Ron Wolf and Davis were watching tape one night of Kansas City Chiefs standout receiver Otis Taylor, and were looking for clues to neutralize this constant threat to the Raiders. On the screen, a receiver caught a pass in full stride and took off like a gazelle. Davis thought it was Taylor, but Wolf nudged him and said, "No, it's Warren Wells." "That guy's good," Davis observed. Ron then informed him that the Chiefs had just cut Wells, who'd been away in the service for 2 years. Davis checked around and found Wells on a bus en route to his hometown in southern Texas and rerouted him to Oakland. One Buffalo area sports writer made a comment that Davis had supernatural powers to be able to locate people. Wells had a great career with the Raiders, but troubles with alcohol and with the law tragically cut his career short after just 3 seasons. With all the pieces in place and the AFL-NFL merger progressing, the Raiders and 49ers were free to play each other in a preseason game before the 1967 regular season began. The 49er players had continued to make remarks about the team across the bay being inferior, and the Raiders were ready to shut them up. After a coin flip, it was determined that the game would be played in the new Oakland Coliseum. The 49ers ended up winning that first Trans-Bay contest 13-10. But the Raiders would go on to the Super Bowl that year and would end up beating San Francisco during each of the next 4 preseasons. In the 10-year history of the AFL, the 1967 Raiders were the only team to record a 13-win season over the course of a 14-game schedule. That year, the Raiders as a team led the league in points scored and were third in total offense. But it was the defense that commanded the spotlight. The defense terrorized quarterbacks, recorded 67 sacks and 30 interceptions in 14 games. They also racked up 6 defensive touchdowns. Their dominating play resulted in their first and only AFL Championship. Dominance, pride, and commitment to excellence. The Raiders opened their season at home against the Denver Broncos on September 10th before a crowd of over 25,000. They watched as Hewitt Dixon caught a touchdown pass, ran for another, and Warren Powers capped the scoring with a 36-yard pick six. The Raiders put up points in every quarter and destroyed the Broncos, 51-0. Still at home in Week 2, the Raiders easily defeated the Boston Patriots 35-7 before another crowd of over 25,000. Quarterback Darryl LaMonica threw 3 touchdown passes and ran for another to lead the potent Oakland offense. In 2 games, the defense had only given up a total of 7 points. After a bye week, the Raiders faced their divisional nemesis, the Kansas City Chiefs, playing their 3rd consecutive game in the Alameda Coliseum. But this time, the crowd was well over 50,000. 2 LaMonica touchdown passes and 3 field goals by 40-year-old George Blanda was enough to hold off a Chiefs rally, and the home team prevailed 23-21. The Raiders now took a 3-0 record to the East Coast to take on the New York Jets. In front of a crowd of more than 63,000 at Shea Stadium, the Jets' defense shut down the potent Raiders' offense in the first half, rendering them scoreless. The Silver and Black made a comeback in the second half, with LaMonica throwing 2 more touchdown passes, but the Jets won the game by a score of 27-14. Because of the Raiders' ferocious play on defense, one New York sports writer called the Raiders' defense the 11 Angry Men, and the term stuck. A crowd of nearly 46,000 saw the Raiders visit Buffalo the following week, and the Raiders avenged their only loss of the season. The Raiders built a 17-7 halftime lead and then scored a late touchdown to beat the Bills 24-20, and what many consider to be the pivotal win that season. The Raiders completed their East Coast swing in Week 6 with a resounding 48-14 thumping of the Boston Patriots. Darryl LaMonica threw for 4 more touchdowns. George Blanda also had a touchdown pass, and Roger Hagberg caught 1 touchdown pass and ran another one in. The Raiders now stood at 5-1. Back home the next week against the rival San Diego Chargers before a crowd of well over 53,000 fans, the happy home crowd saw the Raiders blitz the Chargers 51-10. After a close win at Denver and another bye week, the Raiders finished out the regular season with wins over Miami at home, Kansas City on Thanksgiving Day in the Heartland, San Diego, where the Raiders battled for first place in the division against the Chargers, then a victory in Houston in the team's 3rd consecutive week on the road. Then they came home to avenge their only loss of the year, beating the New York Jets 38-29, before closing out the season with a home win over the Buffalo Bills. They now stood at 13-1 and were set to take on the Houston Oilers in the AFL Championship game and the right to represent the AFL in Super Bowl II in Miami. On the strength of a fake field goal that resulted in a Darryl LaMonica touchdown toss and a tenacious Oakland defense. The home Oakland crowd saw the Raiders complete a miraculous turnaround. Just 7 years earlier, they had lost 19 consecutive games and were playing in a temporary makeshift facility. Now they were the toast of the Bay Area and headed toward a Super Bowl date with destiny. The Raiders won the 1967 AFL Championship with a resounding 40-7 victory. In the second NFL AFL Championship game, the Raiders met the monarchs of professional football, the Green Bay Packers, in what was to be Vince Lombardi's last game with the Pack. Each team's offense scored 2 touchdowns, but the differences were 4 Packer field goals and costly Oakland mistakes. Green Bay prevailed 33-14. 1967 was a great season for the Silver and Black. Not only did they make the playoffs for the first time with their first division title, but they won the AFL title and posted the best regular season record in AFL history. John Roush was named the AFL Coach of the Year. Among Roush's assistant coaches was new linebackers coach John Madden. When Al Davis had come to Oakland in 1963, it was to build a winning organization that would be both respected and feared. The year 1967 marked the threshold of that legacy, which would go on to include 12 division titles and 3 Super Bowl championships over the next 20 years. In our next episode, we will see how the man known as the Genius would fight hard to maintain his edge over the competition. For as tough as it is to become a champion, it's even tougher to stay a champion, especially when you have bitter rivals such as the Chiefs, Chargers, Jets, and Oilers all gunning for you. Join me next time as we venture into the year 1968. Once again, I would like to thank Jim Otto, Murray Olderman, Coach Tom Flores, Kim Rappaport, NFL Films, and the City of Oakland for their contributions toward the content of this podcast. Until next time, this is T3 Raider Facts, reminding you that passion always outlives fashion. And here's wishing you a bright silver moon shining in the dark black night. Take care, everybody.